Alexander Sterling was a man who seemed to have it all: wealth, power, and a lifestyle that most people could only dream of. His mansion stood like a palace on the edge of the city, surrounded by high walls, perfectly trimmed gardens, and fountains that sparkled in the sunlight. Every morning, the sun would reflect off the marble floors and grand glass windows, making the mansion look like it had been pulled straight out of a movie. Yet behind this beauty, Alexander's life was quiet, almost lonely. He had built his fortune with sheer intelligence and hard work, but that same focus had cost him friendships, love, and trust. People admired him, but very few really knew him. The mansion was more than just a house. It was a world of its own, filled with secrets, luxury, and a strict routine. Every room told a story of wealth, from the golden chandeliers that hung from the ceilings to the antique paintings that decorated the walls. But despite all this richness, there was an air of emptiness, as if the walls themselves whispered of the solitude that surrounded Alexander. He moved through the corridors with a calm, almost commanding presence, yet there was a shadow behind his sharp eyes, a hidden part of him that very few had ever seen. Into this world came Emily, a young maid who had just started her job in the mansion. She was new to such luxury, having grown up in a small town where life was simple. She had never seen so many servants in one place, nor such vast rooms, each larger than the homes she had known. As she stepped inside the mansion for the first time, she felt both awe and nervousness. Her eyes wandered from the polished floors to the sparkling chandeliers, and finally rested on Alexander, who stood quietly observing the staff. His presence was intimidating yet strangely magnetic. His tailored suit, perfectly combed hair, and calm expression gave him an air of authority that made everyone stop and take notice. Emily tried to steady her nerves as she approached him, carrying the cleaning supplies she had been assigned to use. Alexander looked at her with a calm, almost piercing gaze, but he did not speak immediately. Instead, he measured her, silently evaluating how she would fit into the strict order of his mansion. Emily felt her heart beat faster, uncertain if it was fear, respect, or something else entirely. She reminded herself that she was just a maid, here to do her work, nothing more, and yet she could not shake the feeling that this place, and this man, was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The mansion had its own rhythm, and Emily had to learn it quickly. Every day started early, with the staff moving silently like a well-oiled machine. The rooms needed to be spotless, the meals perfectly timed, and every task had to be completed without drawing unnecessary attention. Alexander rarely spoke to anyone beyond giving instructions, but his expectations were always clear. His wealth allowed him comfort, but it also came with rules that could feel suffocating to someone new. Emily struggled at first, dropping a vase here or spilling water there, but she quickly learned that mistakes were not welcomed lightly. She started paying attention to the smallest details, trying to understand the unspoken rules of the mansion. Yet, despite the strictness and the routine, there was something strangely inviting about the mansion, something that whispered stories of hidden emotions, past secrets, and perhaps forbidden connections. Emily began to notice small things: a fleeting glance from Alexander, a room left slightly ajar, the way shadows moved differently in the corridors at night. It was almost as if the house itself had a heartbeat, and Emily had just begun to hear it. She was intrigued, cautious, and even a little excited, for she knew that life here would never be ordinary. Alexander, for his part, watched Emily carefully. He had seen many people come and go in his mansion, but something about her was different. There was innocence, curiosity, and a quiet strength that reminded him of a time long ago when he had allowed himself to trust. He did not speak much to her yet, but he noticed her every move, every reaction, and every question that lingered behind her polite expressions. He was used to control, used to having everything in order, but Emily was not like the other staff, and he felt an unfamiliar stir of interest. As the days passed, Emily settled into her routine, cleaning the grand halls, polishing the endless mirrors, and arranging the flowers that decorated the rooms. She learned the quiet rules of the mansion and began to understand the man who ruled over it. Yet no matter how much she tried to focus on her work, she could not ignore the intensity in Alexander's gaze, nor the way the mansion seemed to hold more than just wealth within its walls. It was a place of power, mystery, and perhaps danger. And Emily was already caught in its spell, unknowingly stepping into a story far bigger and more complicated than she could have ever imagined. The mansion and the millionaire were more than just her workplace. They were the beginning of an experience that would challenge her emotions, test her courage, and change her life forever. Emily had been working in the mansion for a few days now, learning the rhythms and rules of the grand house. The corridors seemed endless, each room larger and more dazzling than the last, but she had started to grow comfortable with the tasks, polishing, cleaning, arranging, and making sure everything sparkled just as Alexander liked it. Yet there was one part of the mansion she had not dared to explore on her own, the study, a room that Alexander seemed to occupy most of the time. The doors were always closed, the curtains heavy, and there was a certain hush whenever anyone passed by. Emily had heard rumors from the other staff about Alexander's intensity, how he rarely spoke casually, and how his gaze could make even the boldest servant nervous. One afternoon, as Emily was dusting the shelves in the library, she heard footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate, and heavy. She froze, her heart beating faster than it should, and turned toward the sound. There he was, Alexander Sterling, walking down the hall, his sharp eyes scanning the room as if noticing everything at once. Emily instinctively straightened, adjusting her uniform and trying to appear composed. She had never been this close to him, and yet something about his presence made the air feel thicker, almost electric. Alexander stopped at the doorway, looking at her with an unreadable expression. He did not speak immediately, simply observing, and Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. There was authority in the way he carried himself, but also a strange curiosity, as if he was trying to understand her. Emily swallowed hard, unsure if she should speak or simply stay silent. Finally, she managed a quiet, "Good afternoon, sir." Her voice sounded smaller than she intended, and she could feel her cheeks warm. Alexander nodded, but it was a slow, deliberate motion, and his eyes seemed to follow her every move. "You are new here," he said finally, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made her heart skip. Emily nodded. "Yes, sir, just started this week." She tried to sound confident, but her hands trembled slightly as she held the feather duster. He studied her for a moment longer, and then spoke again. "Do you understand the rules of this mansion?" Emily hesitated, not wanting to admit that she had only begun to learn them, but she nodded carefully. I'm learning, sir." Alexander's lips curved slightly, almost like a smirk, but it was gone in an instant. He turned and walked deeper into the library, leaving her with a mix of relief and curiosity. She realized then that even a few words from him could feel like both a test and an invitation. Over the next few days, Emily began noticing small details about him, small behaviors that revealed more than his words ever would. He had a habit of touching objects lightly, as if checking their alignment or their placement. He often paused by the windows, looking out but seeing nothing, lost in thought, and sometimes, when no one else was around, he would glance at her briefly, just long enough to make her feel both noticed and uneasy. There was something magnetic about him, a force that drew attention without effort, yet it carried danger for those who got too close. Emily started to question herself, wondering if she was imagining the intensity in his gaze or the curiosity in his rare smiles. She tried to remind herself that he was her employer, that this was just a job, and yet, every interaction left her heart racing. Every command, every glance, seemed to hint at a story behind the walls of the mansion, a story she was only beginning to touch. One evening, while arranging books in the library, she accidentally knocked a stack of papers to the floor, and Alexander appeared almost instantly, as if he had been watching. She froze, expecting anger or scolding, but instead he simply knelt to pick them up, handing them to her with a quiet, "Be careful." His tone was calm, almost gentle, but Emily felt an electric shiver run through her. It was the first time she had seen him act in a way that was not cold or strict, and it made her question everything she thought she knew about him. That moment stayed with her, a mix of fear, fascination, and curiosity. She realized that working in this mansion was not just about cleaning or serving, it was about navigating a world of power, mystery, and emotions she had never encountered before, and at the center of it all was Alexander Sterling, a man who was as dangerous as he was intriguing, and who seemed to be drawing her into his world in ways she could not yet understand. By the end of the week, Emily knew one thing for certain: nothing in this mansion was ordinary, and her life had already begun to change. She was no longer just a maid, she was a participant in a story that was far from over, and the first real encounter with Alexander had set the stage for secrets, surprises, and attention that neither of them could ignore. It was late one evening when the mansion seemed quieter than usual. The halls were dimly lit, the chandeliers casting long shadows that danced along the polished floors. Emily had been finishing her chores, her footsteps soft as she moved from room to room. She thought she was alone, but the feeling in the air was different that night, heavy, charged, almost as if the house itself was holding its breath. Alexander had been in the study for hours, going through documents and letters, the faint sound of paper rustling filling the room. Emily paused at the doorway, unsure if she should continue with her work or quietly leave, but then she noticed that the study door was slightly ajar, a small invitation she could not resist. Curiosity got the better of her, and she stepped closer, peeking inside, her heart racing. He was sitting at the massive oak desk, shoulders tense, hands moving with precise motions, but when he noticed her standing there, he did not scold her or ask her to leave. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. Emily felt as if he could see straight through her, reading her thoughts and fears with an intensity that made her knees weak. She took a small step forward, then stopped, unsure what to do. And then he spoke, his voice low, deliberate, almost a whisper. "I need to make passion, don't move." The words hung in the air, echoing in the quiet room. Emily froze, her breath catching, her mind racing to understand what he had just said. She could feel her pulse in her ears, a strange mixture of fear, confusion, and something she could not name. It was both terrifying and strangely magnetic. For a moment, she thought she should run, leave the room, and never look back, but something in the way he said it, the calm authority in his voice, made her stay rooted to the spot. She noticed the way his fingers lightly tapped the desk, the way his eyes never left hers. There was power in his presence, a pull she could not resist, and yet she knew she had to be careful, for this was a man who commanded everything around him, including emotions. Emily tried to steady herself, whispering a quiet, "Sir," but her voice trembled, betraying the nervousness she tried to hide. Alexander's gaze softened just slightly, but there was still that dangerous edge, a hint that he was used to getting what he wanted. She realized then that this mansion was not just a place of luxury, it was a place where emotions could be tested, boundaries could be crossed, and lives could be changed forever. The minutes felt like hours as they stood there, neither speaking for a long while. The tension between them was tangible, filling the room like smoke. Emily could feel her own heartbeat, rapid and loud, each beat reminding her that she was part of something far bigger than she had imagined. She had never experienced anything like this before, never felt so seen, so noticed, and yet so small in comparison to someone so powerful. Alexander finally stood, moving slowly around the desk, his steps measured, deliberate. Emily stayed where she was, unsure whether to move or to speak. He stopped just a few feet away, looking down at her, and for a moment, it felt as if the world outside the study had disappeared, leaving only the two of them and the tension that crackled between them. There was an unspoken understanding that things had shifted, that nothing would ever be the same. When he finally spoke again, it was softer, almost reflective. "You are not like the others," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily did not understand fully what he meant, but she sensed it was not a compliment or a warning. It was something in between, a hint that she had entered a world where rules were not always clear, and feelings could be dangerous. She nodded silently, trying to appear calm, though inside she was trembling with both fear and fascination. As the night grew darker, Emily left the study, her mind replaying every word, every glance, every unspoken message that had passed between them. She knew one thing for certain, the mansion was no longer just her workplace, and Alexander was no longer just her employer. Something had shifted in the air, something dangerous, something powerful, and she was already caught in its pull. She could not stop thinking about the whisper, about the way his words had echoed in her mind, leaving her both terrified and strangely intrigued. That night, as she lay in her small room within the mansion, Emily could not sleep. Her thoughts kept returning to the study, to Alexander, to the dangerous whisper that had changed everything. She realized that her life in the mansion had become more than cleaning, more than work. It had become a story filled with tension, secrets, and emotions she did not yet understand, and deep down, she knew that what happened next would change everything, for the mansion, for Alexander, and for her, was only just beginning. After that night in the study, Emily could not stop thinking about Alexander, his words, his gaze, the intensity in his presence. They replayed in her mind over and over. She went about her chores during the day, dusting the endless halls, polishing the marble floors, arranging flowers in every corner, but her mind was elsewhere, floating between fear and fascination. She could feel a strange mix of emotions stirring inside her. She tried to focus on her work, reminding herself that she was just a maid, but every glance from Alexander, every movement he made, seemed to pull her thoughts back to him. Emily began noticing small signs in herself, moments of hesitation, of nervous excitement. Her heart would race when she passed him in the corridors, and she could not help but wonder if he noticed her too. The simple act of carrying a tray of tea or folding linen suddenly became loaded with meaning. Every shared look, every brief interaction seemed to carry more than it should. She felt caught in a storm she did not understand, a whirlwind of feelings that were new and confusing. At the same time, Emily felt fear, a deep, instinctive warning that Alexander's world was not safe. His whisper, the intensity of his gaze, the power he carried, these things were dangerous. She had grown up in a simple town, where life was clear and rules were easy to follow, and yet here, in this mansion of wealth and secrets, she found herself walking a thin line, unsure where curiosity ended and danger began. Every moment she spent near him was exciting, but also terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff, not knowing whether to jump or step back. She began writing in her diary, pouring out her thoughts and feelings, trying to make sense of the chaos inside her. Why do I feel drawn to him? She wrote one night. Why does his presence scare me, yet excite me at the same time? The questions had no answers, and that made her restless. She was learning that working in the mansion was more than performing chores or following orders. It was about navigating emotions she had never faced before, understanding a world filled with power, control, and secrets that could change a life in a single moment. Meanwhile, Alexander himself was a mystery she could not solve. She watched him from afar sometimes, noticing the way he carried himself, the small gestures that hinted at vulnerability beneath his strict exterior. There were moments when his gaze softened, moments when he seemed lost in thought, almost human in a way that contradicted the authority he demanded from everyone around him. Emily wondered about his past, about the experiences that shaped the man who whispered such strange, dangerous words to her. Emily also struggled with guilt, a quiet voice in her mind telling her that she should not feel this way. She reminded herself that he was her employer, a man of immense power, and she was just a young maid, yet her feelings did not disappear. She began noticing subtle changes in herself, small shifts in behavior that showed her attraction, her curiosity, and her fear. It was a confusing, contradictory mix, and she spent hours trying to untangle it. Sometimes she wanted to confront him, to ask why he made her feel so much, and sometimes she wanted to hide from him forever. The mansion, which had once seemed like a place of simple work and routine, now felt like a stage where every glance, every word, every gesture carried weight. Emily realized that she was no longer just observing her surroundings. She was part of a story that had already begun to unfold, one that involved danger, desire, and secrets that could unravel at any moment. She could feel herself changing, becoming more aware, more cautious, yet also more daring, as if a hidden part of her wanted to understand the world Alexander represented. By the end of the week, Emily understood that she was trapped between two worlds, one safe and familiar, the other dangerous and thrilling. She knew she could not ignore the feelings Alexander had awakened inside her, nor could she fully trust them. Every choice, every movement in the mansion now carried meaning, and she had to navigate carefully. For Emily, the internal conflict was not just about attraction or fear. It was about survival, identity, and understanding the power of a man who could unsettle her heart with a single whisper. And so she continued her days in the mansion, performing her tasks with diligence, yet carrying a secret storm inside, a storm of curiosity, fear, and desire. She knew that this was only the beginning, and that her journey with Alexander Sterling would force her to confront emotions, secrets, and choices she had never imagined. The mansion had become more than a workplace. It had become a world where the rules were hidden, and Emily was learning, slowly and carefully, how to survive and thrive in it. Emily had been in the mansion for weeks now, and she began noticing things that she had never seen before, small details that hinted there was more to Alexander Sterling's life than even the staff realized. At first, it was subtle, a door left slightly open, a drawer that seemed to hide more than it contained, and the occasional hurried glance he cast toward rooms he rarely entered. Emily's curiosity grew stronger with each passing day, the mansion feeling less like a home and more like a puzzle she was desperate to solve. One evening, as she was dusting a bookshelf near the study, she noticed a key tucked behind a stack of books, an old, brass key that seemed oddly out of place. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, and for a moment, she wondered what secrets it might unlock. The mansion had always been strict about boundaries and privacy, yet the key seemed almost like an invitation, a test, or perhaps an accident. Emily's heart raced at the thought of discovering something no one else had seen. She began exploring areas she had never been allowed to enter, moving quietly through the halls, listening for footsteps or voices that might alert Alexander or the other staff. She discovered hidden rooms, some filled with antique furniture covered in dust, and others with stacks of letters, photographs, and ledgers that seemed to tell a story of a life far more complicated than she had imagined. Emily realized that the mansion was not just a house of wealth, it was a repository of secrets, a place where every corner might reveal the truth Alexander had carefully hidden. Emily started piecing things together, noticing patterns in Alexander's behavior, his careful attention to certain objects, the way he locked certain doors, and the rare moments when his usually calm demeanor faltered. She realized that his life outside the mansion, though rarely discussed, had been filled with challenges, betrayals, and decisions that had shaped the man he had become. There was a vulnerability beneath the control, a history that no amount of wealth could erase. One afternoon, she stumbled upon a stack of letters bound together with a red ribbon, addressed to Alexander from someone she did not recognize. As she flipped through them, she discovered references to deals gone wrong, alliances broken, and people who had once trusted him but had disappeared from his life under mysterious circumstances. Emily could see why Alexander had always been so guarded, why his rules were strict, and why his presence was as intimidating as it was magnetic. She also began noticing the small signs of his personal struggles, moments when he seemed lost in thought, staring out of the grand windows at nothing, as if haunted by memories no one else could see. Emily realized that beneath the millionaire's polished exterior was a man shaped by pain, by mistakes, and by choices that weighed heavily on him. The mansion, with all its grandeur, had become both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where Alexander could maintain control while hiding the truths he could not face. Emily's curiosity was tinged with caution, for she knew that discovering too much could be dangerous. The mansion's secrets were not just objects and letters, they were part of Alexander himself, and revealing them could upset the delicate balance of power, trust, and attraction between them. She began to understand that working in this mansion required more than diligence and obedience. It required perception, subtlety, and a careful reading of every gesture, glance, and word. By the end of the week, Emily felt as though she had entered a world that existed in parallel with her own, one full of wealth, power, mystery, and hidden truths. She had glimpsed parts of Alexander that few would ever see, and she realized that her own life had become entwined with his. The mansion was no longer just a place to work, it was a stage for secrets, a labyrinth of emotions, and a testing ground for the choices she would soon have to make. Emily knew, deep down, that discovering the hidden truths was only the beginning, that every secret she uncovered, every small revelation, was leading her towards something larger, something that would challenge her courage, her understanding of Alexander, and her own heart. The mansion had opened its doors, not just to her cleaning or her service, but to a world of mystery, emotion, and danger that was waiting to unfold, and Emily was already caught in its spell. It was a night unlike any other in the mansion, the kind of night that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. Emily had been finishing her chores late in the evening, her footsteps echoing softly against the marble floors. She felt an unusual tension in the air, as if the mansion itself was aware that something extraordinary was about to happen. The lights were dimmed, the shadows long, and even the servants moved with a quiet unease, sensing that the calm of the mansion was only temporary. Alexander had been unusually restless that night, pacing the grand halls in his tailored suit, the crisp fabric brushing against his legs. His jaw was tight, and his eyes darted from room to room as if he expected someone, or something, to appear. Emily watched him from a distance, her heart racing with a strange mixture of curiosity and fear. She knew that when Alexander was like this, nothing was ordinary, and the night would not pass without leaving a mark on her memory. As she carried a tray of tea toward the study, she heard a sudden crash from the west wing, followed by hurried footsteps, metallic clattering, and an unfamiliar voice that made her stop in her tracks. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she instinctively ducked behind a grand curtain, trying to remain unseen. Peeking out, she saw Alexander moving swiftly, almost violently, toward the source of the noise, his face dark with anger and determination. The study door swung open, and for a moment, Emily froze, unsure whether to intervene or stay hidden. Then she saw it, an envelope, thrown across the room, its contents spilling onto the floor, and Alexander's face turning pale as he recognized what had been revealed. Papers, letters, and photographs lay scattered, exposing secrets that had been buried for years, secrets that Alexander thought no one would ever discover. Emily stepped closer, unable to resist, and caught a glimpse of the truth. The letters were evidence of betrayal, deals gone wrong, and a connection to someone from Alexander's past who had threatened everything he had built. Her heart raced as she realized that the man she had found both intimidating and fascinating was suddenly vulnerable, raw, and unshielded. The aura of power he always carried seemed to falter, revealing a side of him that few had ever seen. Alexander's eyes fell on Emily, sharp and calculating at first, then softer, as if seeking understanding. "Get out," he said in a low voice, but there was a hint of desperation behind the command. Emily hesitated, torn between obeying and wanting to stay to witness the unraveling of a man whose life had always seemed untouchable. She finally nodded and stepped back, watching as Alexander moved to gather the scattered papers, each movement tense, controlled, but full of emotion. Suddenly, a knock came at the study door, and a figure stepped inside, the unexpected visitor causing Alexander to stiffen completely. The confrontation was immediate, words exchanged with a sharpness that echoed through the mansion. Emily could not hear all that was said, but she could feel the energy, the danger, and the magnitude of the revelation. Something that had been hidden, carefully protected, was now exposed, and it threatened to destroy the delicate balance of the mansion and everyone in it. Emily felt a surge of fear for Alexander. Despite everything she had thought about him, she realized that beneath his wealth, power, and authority, he was deeply human, capable of emotions that could overwhelm even someone as strong and disciplined as he appeared. And in that moment, she understood the true stakes of the mansion, the life she had entered, and the dangerous currents of secrecy, trust, and betrayal swirling around them. By the time the visitor left, Alexander was pale but composed, his control returning, yet Emily knew that nothing would ever be the same. The shocking event had opened doors that could not be closed, exposing a side of Alexander that even she had never imagined. It was a night that would be remembered, a night when power met vulnerability, and secrets met discovery. And Emily knew that she had been part of something that would shape the rest of her life. As she returned to her small room that night, her hands still trembling, she realized the mansion was no longer just a place of work, nor was Alexander simply an employer. They were now part of a story far larger than either of them had anticipated, a story filled with danger, revelation, and the shocking truth that nothing in this world of wealth and power was ever certain. The mansion had changed, and so had Emily, forever. The morning after the shocking event, the mansion felt different, heavier, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of the secrets that had been exposed. Emily moved quietly through the halls, careful not to disturb anyone, but she could feel the tension lingering in the air. Every glance, every step, seemed charged with an unspoken understanding that nothing would ever be the same. She had witnessed a side of Alexander that few had seen, and now the consequences of that night were beginning to ripple through their lives. Alexander, usually so composed and untouchable, seemed to carry a new vulnerability. The lines on his face were sharper, his movements more deliberate, as if every action required extra thought. He had faced the exposure of his secrets, the intrusion into the carefully controlled life he had built, and now he was forced to reckon with the reality that some things could not be undone. Emily noticed the subtle changes in him, the way he paused more often, the way he seemed to weigh every word before speaking, and the rare moments when his eyes betrayed emotion. For Emily, the consequences were just as profound, but in a different way. She found herself reflecting on everything she had witnessed, the whispered words, the scattered letters, the confrontation that had left the mansion buzzing with tension. Her emotions were a tangled mix of fear, curiosity, and a strange attraction. She realized that she had been drawn into a world far more dangerous and complex than she had imagined, and there was no turning back. The staff, too, had begun to notice subtle shifts in the mansion. Though they did not fully understand the source, Alexander's usual strictness was tinged with caution. and his rare displays of vulnerability left everyone unsettled. Emily observed these changes silently, understanding that the consequences of the previous night were not limited to Alexander and herself, but extended to everyone who lived and worked within the mansion's walls. As the days passed, Emily began to see the impact of secrets revealed. She noticed the way Alexander interacted with her differently, less commanding, but more intense, as if measuring her reactions, testing her limits, and gauging her understanding of the events that had unfolded. There was a tension between them, a delicate balance of trust and caution, and Emily realized that every word, every glance, carried weight. Every step she took had consequences, not just for her, but for the man she had begun to understand in ways no one else could. Alexander, despite his control, could not escape the consequences of his past, the exposure of the letters, the confrontation with the visitor, and the unraveling of carefully hidden truths forced him to confront parts of himself he had long buried. He was a man who had always thrived on power, precision, and secrecy, yet now he was reminded that no matter how carefully one controls life, some things have a way of surfacing, and the past has a habit of demanding attention. Emily, in turn, learned that her actions and choices mattered more than she had realized. Every step she took in the mansion, every decision to observe, to question, or to stay silent, was part of a larger web of consequences. She had become more aware, more perceptive, and more cautious, understanding that this world of wealth, secrets, and power was as much about survival as it was about fascination. By the end of the week, the mansion felt like a changed place, not in its architecture, but in its atmosphere. There was a tension that lingered, a sense that the events of the shocking night had altered the course of lives forever. Alexander seemed more guarded, yet more human, Emily more aware of herself, and the staff quietly adjusted to the subtle shifts in their employer's mood. It was clear that consequences were not just about immediate actions, they were about the long-lasting impact on relationships, emotions, and trust. As Emily lay in her room that night, she reflected on the weeks that had passed, on the secrets she had uncovered, the emotions she had felt, and the events that had changed everything. She understood that life in the mansion was no longer simple, nor would it ever be. Every choice carried weight, every glance and word had significance, and she was now an integral part of a story that was far from finished. The consequences of the shocking event would continue to unfold, shaping the lives of both Alexander and Emily in ways neither could have imagined. The mansion, once a place of routine and control, had become a place of tension, emotion, and revelation, and Emily knew that she had survived the first wave, but the deeper challenges, secrets, and tests were yet to come. The consequences were only the beginning, and the story was far from over. The mansion was quiet that morning, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, casting long golden beams across the polished floors. Emily walked through the halls with a sense of calm she had not felt before. Her tasks were no longer just chores, they were moments of reflection, of understanding the life she had become a part of. She had grown, learned, and survived experiences that had tested her courage, emotions, and sense of self. The mansion, with all its secrets, wealth, and tension, had changed her, and she realized that she would never see life in the same way again. Alexander Sterling, for his part, seemed transformed as well. He moved with a quiet deliberation, no longer hiding behind rigid authority, yet his aura of power remained. There was a new depth to his gaze, a hint of humility that spoke of lessons learned and vulnerabilities acknowledged. He had faced the exposure of his secrets, the consequences of his past, and the emotional complexity of those around him, and he had emerged changed. The mansion, which had once been a fortress of control, had become a place of reflection, growth, and unexpected connections. Emily and Alexander shared a new understanding, unspoken but undeniable. They had been through tension, fear, curiosity, and attraction, and their relationship had evolved beyond the boundaries of employer and employee. There was respect, cautious trust, and a recognition of each other's humanity. The whisper, the secrets, and the shocking events of the mansion had forced them both to confront parts of themselves they had long ignored, and in doing so, they had grown, individually and together. For Emily, the lessons were personal, profound, and enduring. She had discovered her own strength, her ability to navigate danger, and her capacity to feel deeply, even in situations that were frightening or uncertain. The mansion had tested her, but it had also revealed her resilience, curiosity, and courage, she realized that life was not just about following rules or performing tasks. It was about understanding emotions, reading people, and making choices that reflected her values and instincts. Alexander, on the other hand, learned that power alone could not protect him from the consequences of his past, nor could it shield him from human emotion. He had seen the impact of secrets, the danger of obsession, and the importance of trust, and he understood that control was not the same as connection. That night in the study, the letters, the confrontation, they had been moments of revelation, forcing him to reconsider his life, his decisions, and the relationships he had built or neglected. The consequences had shaped him, just as they had shaped Emily. As days turned into weeks, the mansion slowly regained its rhythm, but with a new energy. The staff continued their duties, aware of the subtle changes in their employer, yet also sensing that the mansion was no longer a place of rigid control. It had become a place of human complexity, emotion, and learning, a world where lives intersected, secrets were uncovered, and trust had to be earned and maintained. Emily felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing she had survived, understood, and adapted. Reflecting on her journey, Emily realized that she had entered the mansion as a timid, inexperienced maid, and she was leaving as someone wiser, stronger, and more aware of the intricate dynamics of human behavior. She understood the dangers of power, the pull of attraction, and the weight of secrets, and she knew that these lessons would stay with her forever. Meanwhile, Alexander, now facing his past and acknowledging his flaws, began to consider a life where vulnerability was not weakness, but a bridge to connection and understanding. The mansion, in the end, had been more than a home, more than a workplace, more than a collection of wealth and luxury. It had been a crucible, shaping the lives of those within it, revealing hidden truths, and forcing both Alexander and Emily to grow in ways they could never have predicted. Emily left her room that morning with a sense of clarity and readiness for whatever the future held, knowing that she had learned the most valuable lessons of all: courage, awareness, and the strength to face life with both heart and mind open. And as she walked past Alexander, their eyes met for a brief moment, an understanding passing between them, unspoken yet complete. The story of the mansion, its secrets, and the emotions that had unfolded. There was a chapter in both their lives that would never be forgotten, a story of power, desire, fear, and growth, coming to a quiet, reflective, and meaningful close.